"I want the fat one," the mountain man pointed at the labor girl the entire town laughed at. The street fell silent, except for cruel laughter echoing through the dust. A scarred stranger chose the one everyone mocked, but what looked like a joke in the eyes of the crowd was the beginning of something no one could have expected. She wasn't just a labor girl. She carried a dangerous secret papers that could bring down powerful men and free families robbed of their water and land. The railroad wanted her silenced, the marshal locked her in chains, and the mountain man, he was the only one willing to stand between her and ruin. Church bells rang, jail keys rattled, hooves thundered in the night as truth clawed its way into the open. Would a woman once scorned as worthless become the very one to expose the lies of an empire? Or would the laughter of the town be the last sound she ever heard? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun beat down on the dusty Colorado street as Scarlet May pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fabric, worn thin from years of use, offered little protection from the cutting glances of the gathered crowd. She stood among a cluster of women at the hiring corner, each hoping for work as a cook or housekeeper at one of the local ranches. The crunch of boots on wooden planks drew closer as ranch foremen moved down the line, studying each woman with calculating eyes. Scarlet kept her gaze fixed on the ground, counting the pebbles scattered across the packed earth. Her heart thundered against her ribs as the men approached her position. "Well, what do we have here?" A nasal voice cut through the morning air. The speaker, a wiry foreman with a weather-beaten face, stopped directly in front of her. "Looks like we got ourselves the fat one today, boys." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Heat flooded Scarlet's cheeks, but she forced herself to remain still. Moving would only draw more attention, and attention had never brought her anything but pain. She'd learned that lesson well over the years. "Reckoned she'd eat more than she'd cook," another voice called out, triggering fresh waves of laughter. Scarlet's fingers twisted in her shawl, knuckles white with tension. She'd known this would happen, it always did. But she needed work. The few coins left in her purse wouldn't buy another night's lodging at the boarding house, let alone food. The foreman circled her like a wolf sizing up prey. "What you think, fellas? Think she'd break the wagon springs before we even made it back to the ranch?" More laughter. More burning shame. Scarlet blinked rapidly, willing back the tears that threatened to spill. Crying would only make it worse. She'd learned that lesson too. The sound of heavy boots on the boardwalk cut through the mockery. A shadow fell across the dust at her feet, and the laughter died away like wind across the prairie. Scarlet dared to lift her eyes. A mountain of a man stood there, his presence commanding silence from the crowd. His face bore a web of scars that spoke of violence and survival, and his eyes held a hardness that made even the cruel foreman take a step back. She recognized him vaguely. Hudson Boone, the reclusive trapper who occasionally traded furs in town. Boone's gaze swept over the gathering, lingering on the foreman who'd started the taunting. Without a word, he lifted one calloused hand and pointed directly at Scarlet. "I want the fat one." The crowd erupted again, but this time their laughter held a different edge, uncertainty. Boone didn't move, didn't speak again. He simply stood there, his stance solid as an oak, until his unwavering stare silenced them one by one. Scarlet's heart raced for a different reason now. She'd heard whispers about Boone, that he lived alone in the mountains, that he'd survived battles with both men and beasts. Some said he hadn't spoken more than 10 words together in the past 5 years. The foreman tried to recover his bravado. Well, looks like even mountain men get lonely." Boone's head turned toward him, slowly, deliberately. Whatever the foreman saw in those eyes made him swallow the rest of his words and step back, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Miss?" Boone's voice was rough from disuse, but not unkind. He held out one massive hand, waiting. Scarlet glanced at his outstretched palm, then back at his face. In those scarred features, she saw no mockery, no cruel amusement, only patience and something that might have been understanding. Her options were few: stay here and face more ridicule, return to her nearly empty room, or take a chance on this stranger's offer. She placed her hand in his. Boone nodded once, then turned and began walking. Scarlett hurried to keep pace with his long strides, aware of the whispers that followed them down the street. She couldn't tell if they were words of scandal or concern, and found she didn't much care. Anything was better than the open mockery of before. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks when they reached their destination, a modest boarding shack on the outskirts of town. The building looked sturdy enough, if plain, with a small vegetable patch to one side and a stack of firewood against the wall. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. Scarlett stood in the yard, her carpet bag clutched to her chest, watching as Boone unlocked the door. Her heart fluttered with uncertainty. She'd accepted his offer without knowing his intentions, driven by desperation and the need to escape the crowd's cruelty. Now, alone with him as darkness approached, doubt crept in. Boone pushed the door open and stepped aside, giving her plenty of space to enter or flee as she chose. The simple gesture, considering her comfort, eased some of her anxiety. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, passing close enough to catch the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his coat. The interior was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting warm light across simple furnishings. A table with 2 chairs, a cupboard with dishes, and 2 doors that presumably led to sleeping quarters. Everything was neat, orderly, and somehow lonely. "Temporary," Boone said, breaking the silence. "Until spring trading's done." He gestured to the smaller of the 2 doors. "Your room. Lock works." He pulled a key from his pocket and placed it on the table, then moved to stoke the fire. Scarlett picked up the key, feeling its weight in her palm. A room of her own, with a lock she controlled. The simple trust of it, the respect for her privacy and safety, brought a lump to her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. Boone nodded without looking up from the fire. "Cupboard needs organizing. Cooking too, if you're willing." He paused, then added quietly, "Pays fair." "I'm a good cook," she said, her voice stronger now. "Used to run the kitchen for a railroad camp. I can keep accounts too, if you need." He turned then, studying her with those deep-set eyes. "Good. We'll talk terms in the morning." He moved toward the other door. His room, she assumed, then stopped. "No one bothers you here. My word on it." With that, he disappeared into his room, leaving Scarlett alone in the main area. She stood for a moment, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire, feeling the weight of the key in her hand and the lingering warmth of those simple words. "No one bothers you here." Moving to her assigned room, she found it small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest for her belongings, and a window that looked out over the vegetable patch. The lock worked smoothly, just as he'd said. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Scarlett felt something like peace settle over her. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her spare dress on a peg and placing her mother's old Bible on the chest. The distant howl of a coyote floated through the window, reminding her of how far she was from the crowded town center. But instead of fear, she felt only relief. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she was safe. The key was hers, the room was hers, and her defender was just on the other side of the wall. It wasn't much, perhaps, but after years of mockery and uncertainty, it felt like the beginning of something new. Scarlett sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the clean quilt, and offered up a silent prayer of thanks. Outside, the last light of day painted the Colorado sky in shades of purple and gold, and somewhere in the distance, a whip-poor-will began its evening song. The firelight danced across the worn floorboards as Scarlett perched on the edge of a wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The steady click and scrape of Hudson cleaning his rifle filled the quiet evening air. He worked with methodical patience, each movement precise and practiced. A tin cup of coffee sat cooling on the table before her, offered without ceremony when they'd come inside. Its warmth seeped through the thick ceramic, giving her restless hands something to hold onto. The familiar scents of gun oil and wood smoke mingled with the bitter coffee aroma, reminding her of evenings at the railroad camp, though there, the air had been thick with crude language and cruder intentions. Here, the silence felt different, respectful, almost. Hudson hadn't tried to make small talk or press her with questions. He simply worked at his task, his presence solid and unchanging as the mountains themselves. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Cabin needs tending." He glanced up briefly from his work. Cooking, mending, fair wage for honest work. Scarlett's shoulders relaxed slightly. These were terms she understood, tasks she could manage. "I can cook," she offered quietly. "Been doing it since I was a girl. And I'm handy with a needle." Hudson nodded, running an oiled cloth along the rifle's barrel. "No mockery here," he added, as if sensing her lingering unease. "Just work that needs doing." The simple statement, delivered without flourish or false sentiment, loosened something in Scarlett's chest. She took a sip of coffee, gathering her courage. The secret she carried had been burning inside her for weeks, making her jump at shadows and peer around corners. Something about Hudson's steady presence made her want to share the burden. "I used to cook at a railroad camp," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Up near Silver Creek." Her fingers tightened around the cup. The men there. They weren't careful about what they said when they thought nobody was listening. Hudson's hand stilled on the rifle, though his expression remained neutral. He waited, giving her space to continue or stop as she chose. "One night, I was collecting dishes after supper. Some men were in the office tent, railroad agents and their hired muscle." Scarlett swallowed hard, the memory sharp as broken glass. They were laughing about the land deeds they'd forged, water rights they'd stolen from settlers and the Ute both. Her voice dropped even lower. "I wasn't meant to hear any of it." The fire popped loudly, making her flinch. Hudson set his rifle aside and leaned forward, his scarred face serious in the lamplight. "They knew you heard?" Scarlett nodded, a tremor running through her hands. "Caught me outside the tent," said they'd. She couldn't finish the sentence, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. "I ran that night. Been moving from town to town since, trying to stay ahead of them. But their reach is long, and I'm running out of places to hide." Hudson was silent for a long moment, studying her with those deep-set eyes. There was no disbelief in his gaze, no dismissal of her story. He'd lived in these territories long enough to know how power worked, how greed could corrupt men's souls. "You're safe here," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of an oath. "My word on it." Scarlett blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance. No demands for proof, no accusations of lying. Just quiet belief and the promise of protection. The evening deepened around them, shadows growing longer as the fire burned lower. Hudson rose to add another log, then began laying out his bedroll near the hearth. Scarlett started to protest, but he cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "Take the cot," he insisted, gesturing to the small bedroom. "Lock works fine. You'll sleep better for it." The consideration in the gesture, giving her both comfort and security, touched something deep in Scarlett's heart. She gathered her shawl around her shoulders and moved toward the bedroom door, pausing in the threshold. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning far more than just the sleeping arrangements. Hudson nodded once, already settling onto his bedroll. "Rest easy," he replied. "Morning comes early in these parts." In her small room, Scarlett changed into her nightdress and knelt beside the narrow cot. The familiar words of prayer came easily tonight, gratitude mixing with pleas for continued safety. Through the door, she could hear Hudson's steady breathing and the occasional pop of the fire, sounds that should have made her nervous, alone in a strange place with a man she barely knew. Instead, they brought an unexpected peace. For the first time since fleeing the railroad camp, Scarlett lay down without scanning the shadows for threats or planning escape routes in her mind. The lock on her door was solid, but it was Hudson's quiet strength that truly made her feel secure. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, tonight she could rest without dread. As sleep began to claim her, Scarlett heard the distant howl of a wolf in the mountains. Rather than fear, The sound brought comfort, a reminder that she wasn't the only one who had learned to survive in this harsh but beautiful land. Her last conscious thought was a prayer of thanks for the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this unlikely sanctuary. Outside her door, Hudson kept his silent vigil by the fire, his rifle close at hand. He'd recognized the truth in her words, the genuine fear in her eyes when she spoke of the railroad men. His jaw tightened at the thought of corrupt men threatening an innocent woman, using their power to silence those who might expose their schemes. The fire crackled low, casting warm light across the rough-hewn floors. In her room, Scarlett's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of true sleep. Hudson allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. She was safe here, for now at least. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this humble cabin, two lonely souls had found an unexpected alliance. The mountain man shifted slightly on his bedroll, adjusting his position to keep both the door and windows in his line of sight. Years of solitude had taught him to sleep lightly, ready for any threat. Tonight, that habit would serve a greater purpose than his own survival. A night bird called somewhere in the darkness, and the wind whispered through the pines. Hudson settled in for his watch, content in the knowledge that for the first time in weeks, his unexpected guest was sleeping without fear. Morning sunlight painted golden stripes across the dusty streets of the frontier town. Scarlett walked beside Hudson, trying to match his unhurried stride as they made their way toward the mercantile. Her shawl was pulled tight despite the warmth of the day, more shield than comfort. The town bustled around them, women in cotton dresses hurrying to complete morning errands, men lounging outside the barber shop, trading stories and tobacco, children chasing hoops down the wooden sidewalks. Normal sounds, normal sights, yet Scarlett's nerves jangled with each passing face, each curious glance. Hudson's solid presence beside her helped steady her racing heart. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew his own strength, unbothered by the townspeople's whispers that followed in their wake. Some pointed, no doubt remarking on the strange pair they made, the massive scarred mountain man and the heavy-set woman in her faded dress. The mercantile's bell chimed as they entered. Inside, the familiar scents of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods wrapped around them. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, nodded at Hudson but eyed Scarlett with barely concealed curiosity. "Morning, Boone," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "What can I get for you today?" Hudson produced a list written in his rough hand. "Need supplies, flour, coffee, beans." His words were few, but clear. As Mr. Peterson gathered their items, Scarlett lingered near the fabric bolts, running her fingers over the rough cotton and wondering if she should ask about thread for mending. The normalcy of the moment almost let her forget her fears. The illusion shattered with the creak of wagon wheels outside. Through the store's cloudy window, she saw a sleek buckboard pull up, its black paint gleaming in the sunday. Her heart stopped as a familiar figure stepped down. A man in a fine suit, his watch chain glinting gold against his vest. Silas Granger, the railroad agent who had threatened her that terrible night at the camp. He swept through the mercantile door like he owned it, his polished boots clicking on the wooden floor. The very air seemed to chill as his cold eyes found Scarlett. Well, he drawled, adjusting his cuffs. "If it isn't our missing cook." His smile never reached his eyes, though thief might be a more accurate description. Scarlett's hands trembled as she gripped a bolt of fabric. I don't know what you mean, sir." "No," Granger's voice carried through the store, drawing the attention of other customers. "Perhaps I should refresh your memory about certain payroll ledgers that went missing the same night you disappeared from our camp." He turned to address the growing crowd. "Valuable documents, containing sensitive company information. Their theft has caused considerable inconvenience." Hudson moved then, stepping between Scarlett and the railroad agent. His massive frame cast a shadow over Granger's fine suit. "Lady says she don't know nothing about it," he rumbled, his tone carrying a clear warning. Granger barely glanced at him, instead raising his voice further. "Marshal Avery has already been notified. He'll be quite interested in questioning this woman about the stolen property." His lip curled. Unless, of course, she'd like to return what she took and avoid any unpleasantness. The other customers whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of scandal and curiosity. Mr. Peterson had stopped measuring flour, his spectacles forgotten in his hand as he watched the scene unfold. Scarlett felt shame burn through her chest. She hadn't stolen any ledgers. She'd only overheard their schemes, their casual discussion of forged documents and stolen rights. But how could she prove it? Who would believe her word against the railroads? She startled slightly as Hudson's rough hand gripped her arm. Not roughly, not to restrain, but to steady her, to remind her she wasn't alone. His touch carried strength and reassurance both. "We're leaving," Hudson stated flatly, dropping coins on the counter for their supplies. His other hand never left Scarlett's arm as he guided her toward the door. "The marshal will hear about this," Granger called after them. "You can't hide her forever, Mountain Man." Hudson didn't respond, just kept moving, protecting Scarlett with his bulk as they exited the store. The morning sun felt harsh now, exposing, as they made their way back through town. Faces turned to watch them pass, and Scarlett heard the murmurs. Railroad theft. Knew she was trouble. That Boone, getting mixed up. The walk back to the boarding house seemed endless. Only when they were safely inside with the door barred did Scarlett let herself shake properly, tears threatening to spill. "I didn't steal anything," she whispered fiercely. "I swear it. I heard things I wasn't supposed to hear, about the water rights, the forged deeds. They're the thieves, not me." Hudson nodded once, already moving to build up the fire. He didn't waste words telling her he believed her. His actions spoke clearly enough. The day crept by with agonizing slowness. They stayed inside, jumping at every sound of horses or boots on the street outside. Hudson cleaned his rifle again, methodically, while Scarlett tried to keep her hands busy making stew. The familiar task helped calm her nerves, though her appetite had fled. As evening painted the sky in deep purples and oranges, they sat at the rough table with bowls of steaming stew before them. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth unable to touch the cold knot of fear in Scarlett's stomach. She pushed the food around with her spoon, lost in thought. "Can't run forever," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The railroad, they won't stop. They have too much to lose if the truth comes out." Hudson set his spoon down, considering her words. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, and somewhere a door slammed. The normal sounds of a town settling into night seemed suddenly threatening. "Got a cabin," he said after a long moment. "Up in the mountains. Remote. Could stay there till things cool down." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your choice. Won't force you either way." Scarlett stared into her cooling stew, weighing her options. The thought of fleeing into the wilderness with a man she barely knew should have terrified her. But the alternative, waiting for Marshal Avery to arrest her on false charges, facing whatever the railroad had planned, that was far more frightening. She looked up, meeting Hudson's steady gaze across the table. In his eyes, she saw no judgment, no demand, just the simple offer of sanctuary. The decision settled heavy in her chest, but in truth, there was no real choice at all. "When do we leave?" she asked quietly. The fire popped and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the town continued its evening routines, unaware that within these walls, two souls were preparing to vanish into the mountain wilderness. Scarlett's stew grew cold, untouched, as they began to plan their escape. Dawn painted the sky in whispers of pink and gold as Hudson hitched his mules to the wooden cart. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the promise of snow from the mountains that loomed ahead. His movements were quick and practiced as he secured their supplies: burlap sacks of flour and beans, tins of coffee, precious lamp oil wrapped carefully in old blankets. Scarlett stood nearby, her worn shawl pulled tight against the chill. She watched him work, fighting the urge to glance over her shoulder at the sleeping town below. Every creak of leather, every snort from the mules made her heart jump, certain it was Marshal Avery's men coming for her. "Best get moving," Hudson said quietly, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. The rough wood planks creaked beneath them as Scarlett settled beside him, clutching her small bundle of belongings. She had so little to show for her years of work, just a spare dress, a comb, and her mother's tattered Bible. The thought brought a lump to her throat. Hudson clicked his tongue, and the mules stepped forward. The cart wheels groaned as they turned onto the mountain trail, leaving the town behind. Scarlett refused to look back, keeping her eyes fixed on the path ahead as it wound upward through stands of aspen and pine. The morning passed slowly as they climbed. The trail grew steeper, narrower. They passed scattered homesteads where thin smoke rose from stone chimneys. A woman hanging washing paused to watch them pass, her face curious but not unfriendly. A man splitting wood by his cabin straightened, nodding at Hudson before returning to his work. No one called out or tried to stop them. "Know most folks up here," Hudson offered, his first words in hours. "Good people, mind their own business." Scarlett nodded, grateful for both the information and his quiet understanding of her fears. The higher they climbed, the more her anxiety began to ease, replaced by wonder at the sweeping views that opened around them. The valley spread out below like a patchwork quilt, squares of harvested fields stitched together by lines of trees and fences. By afternoon, the weather turned. Snow flurries danced in the wind, dusting Scarlett's shawl with white. The mules slowed, picking their way more carefully along the narrowing trail. Hudson handled the reins with calm expertise, murmuring encouragement to the animals when the path grew treacherous. "Never seen mountains like this," Scarlett admitted, her voice soft with awe. Despite her fear of pursuit, she couldn't help marveling at the rugged peaks that thrust up against the steel-gray sky. "Makes a person feel small." Hudson's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Aye, that they do." The snow fell harder as evening approached. Hudson guided the cart off the main trail toward the sound of running water. They emerged into a small clearing beside a creek that tumbled over moss-covered rocks. Tall pines swayed overhead, their branches offering some shelter from the weather. "We'll camp here tonight," Hudson announced, setting the brake. He helped Scarlett down from the seat, his large hands steady and respectful. "Creek's good for water, plenty of dry wood under them pines." While Hudson unhitched the mules and set up a lean-to shelter, Scarlett gathered her courage to be useful. She found dry kindling beneath the pine boughs, just as he'd said, and arranged it carefully, as she'd learned in the railroad camp. Her fingers trembled with cold, but after several attempts, she got a small flame going. "Might try my hand at splitting some wood," she said, eyeing the axe in the cart, "if you'll show me how." Hudson paused in his work, studying her face. Finding no mockery there, he nodded. "Ain't hard once you know the trick of it." He demonstrated the proper stance, how to let the weight of the axe do the work. Scarlett's first few attempts went wild, the axe blade skidding off the log. She felt her face flush hot despite the cold air, waiting for Hudson to laugh. But he simply adjusted her grip, his voice patient as he explained again. On her fifth try, the log split with a satisfying crack. Pride bloomed in Scarlett's chest, a feeling so foreign it took her a moment to recognize it. She caught Hudson watching her, and for the first time, she didn't look away in shame. With the shelter secured and a good pile of wood split, Scarlett turned her attention to supper. She mixed cornmeal and water in their small iron skillet, adding a pinch of salt. The fire had burned down to perfect cooking coals, and soon the smell of baking cornbread filled their camp. They sat close to the fire as darkness gathered, sharing the warm bread and cold beef they'd packed. Scarlett surprised herself by chuckling as she recounted her earlier attempts with the axe. "Reckon that first log is still spinning somewhere," she said, and was rewarded with a quiet laugh from Hudson. The night deepened around them, stars pricking through gaps in the clouds. In the distance, a wolf's howl echoed off the mountainsides. Scarlett tensed, but Hudson seemed unconcerned as he banked the fire for the night. "They won't come near the fire," he assured her, spreading their bedrolls beneath the lean-to. "Get some rest. Trail gets rougher tomorrow." Scarlett lay awake for a while, listening to the creek's song and the occasional wolf cry. But Hudson's steady breathing nearby and the lingering warmth of the fire gradually eased her fears. She thought about the wood she'd split, the bread she'd baked, the way Hudson had treated her like someone capable rather than someone to be mocked. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep, feeling like more than just a burden to be borne. Up here in the mountains, far from the cruel laughter of the town, she was beginning to discover her own worth. The fire crackled low, sending sparks up to dance with the stars. The wolves sang their distant songs, and the creek murmured its eternal lullaby. Above their small camp, the great peaks stood silent guard against the night, while below in the shelter, Scarlet slept without dreams. The morning sun painted long shadows across the trail as Hudson's mule cart climbed higher into the mountains. Scarlet pulled her shawl tighter, watching her breath cloud in the crisp air. The path had grown steeper, winding between towering pines that creaked in the wind. Fresh snow from the night before crunched beneath the mule's hooves. "Almost there," Hudson said, nodding toward a ridge ahead. "Cabin's just over that rise." Scarlet's heart quickened. After days of worrying about pursuit, the promise of shelter, real shelter, felt almost too good to be true. The mules strained against their harnesses as Hudson guided them up the final stretch. As they crested the ridge, Scarlet caught her breath. There, nestled in a natural clearing among the pines, stood Hudson's cabin. Morning light gleamed on its sturdy log walls and pitched roof. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a small covered porch protected the front door. It wasn't large, but to Scarlet's weary eyes, it looked like a palace. Hudson drew the cart to a stop in the yard. "Ain't much," he said gruffly, "but it keeps out the weather." "It's wonderful," Scarlet breathed, meaning it. After years of cramped railroad camp tents and drafty boarding houses, the solid cabin before her seemed the very picture of home. As Hudson unhitched the mules, Scarlet climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs stiff from the journey. She approached the cabin slowly, taking in every detail. A stack of split wood lined one wall. Dried herbs hung from the porch rafters. Through the windows, she could see shelves lined with glass jars, preserved fruits and vegetables that glowed like jewels in the morning light. Hudson stepped past her to unlock the door, which swung open with a creak of iron hinges. "Come on in," he said. "Need to show you where everything is." The cabin's main room was larger than it had appeared from outside. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, its firebox large enough to hold logs that would burn through the night. A wooden table and chair stood nearby, and a rocking chair sat beside the hearth. More shelves lined the walls, holding everything from tools to books to those gleaming preserves she'd spotted through the window. "Kitchen's here," Hudson said, gesturing to a corner equipped with a cast-iron stove, work table, and more shelves of provisions. "Got a pump out back for water. Root cellars under a trap door by the hearth." Scarlet nodded, already planning how she might organize things. The cabin was dusty from Hudson's absence, but she could see the care that had gone into its construction and furnishing. "And up there," Hudson pointed to a ladder that led to a loft space above. "That'll be your sleeping quarters, private-like." Scarlet's throat tightened at his thoughtfulness. He'd clearly given consideration to her comfort and dignity. The loft would be her own space, something she hadn't had since leaving home years ago. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll get it cleaned up straight away." "Need to unload the wagon first," Hudson reminded her. "Storm's coming. Can smell it in the air." They worked together to bring in their supplies, storing everything in its proper place. Scarlet was grateful for the activity. It kept her mind off her troubles and gave her hands purpose. Once the wagon was empty, she found a broom and began attacking the dust while Hudson went out to chop more wood before the weather turned. The steady rhythm of his axe echoed through the cabin as Scarlet swept. She opened windows to let in the fresh mountain air, beat dust from blankets, and arranged her few belongings in the loft. The work felt good, right somehow. This wasn't charity. She was earning her keep, making herself useful. The crack of the axe suddenly changed pitch, followed by a sharp curse. Scarlet's head snapped up. Through the window, she saw Hudson stumble back from the chopping block, clutching his arm. Dark blood welled between his fingers. She ran outside, her heart pounding. Hudson stood rigid, his face pale beneath his beard. A deep gash ran along his forearm where the axe had slipped. "Let me see," Scarlett said firmly, falling back on her experience tending injuries in the railroad camp. When Hudson hesitated, she added, "Please, I know what to do." Slowly, he extended his arm. The cut was bad, not life-threatening, but in need of immediate attention. Without hesitation, Scarlett untied her apron and tore it into strips. "Need to clean it first," she said. "Where's your medical supplies?" "Box under the sink," Hudson ground out. "But I can." "Sit," Scarlett ordered, surprising herself with her authority. More surprising still, Hudson obeyed, lowering himself onto a nearby stump. She hurried inside and found the box, returning with clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey, and bandages. Hudson watched silently as she cleaned the wound with the whiskey. His jaw clenched, but he didn't pull away. "Good thing it wasn't your axe hand," Scarlett commented as she worked, trying to distract him from the pain. "Though I reckon you'd have found a way to keep chopping even if it was." A grunt was his only response, but she caught the slight softening around his eyes. With practiced movements, she bound the gash with strips from her apron, wrapping them snug but not too tight. "There," she said finally. "That should hold, but you'll need to keep it clean, and no more chopping today." Hudson examined her handiwork, flexing his fingers carefully. "You've done this before." "Railroad camps ain't exactly gentle places," Scarlett replied. "Learned to patch up worse than this," he nodded slowly, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps. They were both survivors, each with skills earned through hard experience. "Thank you," he said simply. "Least I could do," Scarlett answered, gathering up the medical supplies. "Now, you get inside and rest that arm. I'll finish up out here." To her surprise, Hudson didn't argue. He rose from the stump and headed for the cabin, though she noticed he paused in the doorway to watch as she carefully gathered the wood he'd already split. By the time Scarlett finished bringing in the wood and securing things for the coming storm, snow had begun falling in earnest. Wind whistled through the pines as she latched the cabin door behind her. Hudson sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, where a fire now blazed welcomingly. "Found some venison in the root cellar," he said. "Thought you might make use of it." Scarlett nodded, already moving toward the kitchen area. "Stew would be good on a night like this. I saw carrots and potatoes down there, too." She worked steadily, cutting vegetables and preparing the meat while Hudson rested. The familiar tasks calmed her, and soon the cabin filled with the rich aroma of simmering stew. Outside, the snow fell thicker, but inside was warm and secure. As she stirred the pot, Scarlett felt an unfamiliar sensation bloom in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as pride, not the defensive pride she'd worn as armor against mockery, but something deeper. Here, in this mountain cabin, she wasn't just someone to be protected. She had protected in turn, had proven her worth not through words but through action. Hudson's steady breathing from the rocking chair mixed with the crack of the fire and the bubble of the stew. Snow brushed against the windows like gentle fingers. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Scarlett felt truly at peace. She glanced at Hudson's bandaged arm and smiled softly. Perhaps they had both found something they needed in this cabin among the pines. Not just shelter from those who would harm them, but the chance to be useful, to be valued, to be whole. The stew simmered, spreading its warmth through the cabin as the mountain night deepened around them. The days following Hudson's injury settled into a peaceful rhythm. Winter wrapped the mountain cabin in its white embrace, transforming the landscape into a pristine wonderland. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves, catching the morning light and scattering rainbow fragments across the snow-covered ground. Inside, the cabin stayed warm and snug. Hudson's arm healed steadily under Scarlett's careful attention. Though he couldn't swing an axe yet, he proved skilled at setting traps with his good hand. Each evening, he returned with rabbits or grouse, sometimes even a plump turkey that had wandered too close to his snares. Scarlett kept busy from sunup to sundown. She darned socks by the window's light, patched Hudson's worn shirts, and kept the cabin spotless. The physical work felt good, purposeful. Her fingers grew nimble with practice, and she took pride in each neat stitch. Their suppers together became a cherished ritual. They'd sit at the sturdy table, sharing whatever game Hudson had caught along with biscuits she'd baked in the morning. Sometimes they talked simple things, like the weather or which preserves were running low. More often they sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth and wind whispering through the pines outside. Yet beneath this peaceful routine, anxiety gnawed at Scarlett's thoughts. Each distant sound made her start. Was it merely a branch creaking under snow, or horses approaching? When Hudson was out checking his trap lines, she found herself peering through frost-rimed windows, searching for signs of pursuit. The railroad agent's threats echoed in her memory. Men like him didn't give up easily. They had resources, influence, and most importantly, patience. How long before they tracked her to these mountains? One evening, after Hudson had gone to feed the mules in the barn, Scarlett could no longer contain her unease. She climbed to her loft and pulled her old leather satchel from beneath the straw-tick mattress. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Beneath a few worn clothes and her mother's tarnished silver thimble lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing several sheets of paper, brown and creased with age. Just touching them made her heart race. The cabin door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and Hudson's heavy footsteps. Scarlett quickly rewrapped the papers but didn't hide them away. Perhaps it was time to share this burden. "Hudson," she called softly, descending the ladder. He looked up from where he was hanging his coat, snowflakes still melting in his beard. Something in her voice must have alerted him, because his expression grew serious. "What is it?" Scarlett crossed to the table and laid the packet down. "There's something you should see." Her fingers shook as she unwrapped the oilcloth. "These are what I took from the railroad camp. The real reason they're hunting me." Hudson pulled a chair close, his movements careful and deliberate. The papers crackled as Scarlett spread them out in the lamplight. "These here," she pointed to several documents bearing official-looking seals. "They're water rights contracts, but look closer at the signatures." Hudson leaned in, squinting at the faded ink. "They're different, same names, but written by different hands." Scarlett nodded. "The railroad men forged new contracts, changed the terms to steal water access from both ranchers and Ute families." Her voice grew bitter. "They figured nobody'd believe Indians over the railroad anyway, and most ranchers can't read well enough to spot the differences." "How'd you come by these?" Hudson asked quietly. "I was cooking for the survey camp." Scarlett's hands twisted in her apron. "Late one night, I heard voices from the office tent. The agent Granger he was drinking with his men, bragging about how clever they'd been, how they'd secured water rights to half the territory through their little adjustments." She swallowed hard. "They left the documents out when they finally passed out. I took them." Hudson studied the papers intently, his scarred face grave in the lamplight. "This is why they're so set on finding you. These could ruin them." "I knew it was dangerous to keep them," Scarlett whispered. "But I couldn't destroy them, not when so many folks stood to lose everything." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. "What if they find us here? What if—" "They won't," Hudson cut in firmly. "But we can't hide forever. These papers need to see proper light. Who'd believe us? The railroad has judges in their pocket." Hudson was quiet for a moment, absently rubbing his healing arm. "Reverend Harlan might. He's got influence, and he's known for standing up to corruption. More importantly, he's respected by both settlers and the Ute people." Scarlett had heard of the circuit-riding preacher. People said he was different from other religious men, that he cared more for justice than for wealthy benefactors. Still, fear clutched at her throat. Showing these could cost us everything. Maybe even our lives. "Hiding them is already costing folks everything," Hudson replied softly. "Sometimes truth demands courage." His words struck something deep in Scarlett's heart. She thought of the families who'd lost their water rights, of children going thirsty while railroad men grew fat on stolen resources. The fear was still there, but something stronger began to grow alongside it: determination. "The snow's been heavy," she said slowly, "but it usually softens some by mid-morning. We could make it down to town then, if we're careful." Hudson nodded, gathering the papers and rewrapping them carefully in their oilcloth. "We'll wait for a clear day. No sense risking the trip in bad weather." He handed the packet back to Scarlett, his rough fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief but reassuring, like everything about him. She tucked the document safely away, feeling both lighter and heavier for having shared their burden. That night, as wind sighed through the pines and moonlight painted silver patterns on the cabin floor, Scarlett lay awake in her loft. The choice ahead weighed heavily on her mind. For weeks, she'd found peace in this mountain sanctuary. Hudson's quiet strength had helped her rediscover her own worth. Was she ready to risk it all for the sake of truth? She thought of Hudson's words about courage. He hadn't pressed her or demanded anything. He'd simply stated what he believed was right, then left the choice to her. That trust, more than anything, helped settle her resolve. Tomorrow they would check the weather. If the sky was clear and the snow beginning to soften, they would make their way down the mountain to seek out Reverend Harlan. The thought still frightened her, but she was no longer the same woman who'd stood trembling at the hiring corner, burning with shame under cruel mockery. She had found strength in this cabin, not just Hudson's protection, but her own capacity to heal and help in return. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall, secure in the knowledge that she was doing what was right. The wind's whisper gradually softened to a lullaby, and Scarlett drifted off to sleep. In her dreams, she stood beneath open skies, no longer running, no longer hiding, free at last to speak truth without fear. The thaw arrived like a whispered promise. First came the drip of icicles outside the cabin windows, then the soft settling of snow as warmth crept back into the mountain air. Within weeks, patches of bare ground emerged beneath the pines, dark and damp with melting drifts. Hudson tested the trail one morning, boots sinking into the softening earth. "Time's come," he said simply when he returned. Scarlett nodded, her heart quickening. They had waited for this, planned for it, yet now that the moment arrived, she felt the weight of their decision settle heavy on her shoulders. They spent that evening, preparing. Scarlett baked extra cornbread and packed dried venison, apples, and the last of their winter preserves into Hudson's oilskin satchel. Her movements were careful, deliberate, each task helping to steady her nerves. Hudson cleaned his rifle and checked the mule's tack by lamplight, his scarred face grave with concentration. Dawn broke clear and cool the next morning. Scarlett wrapped the railroad documents carefully in oilcloth, tucking them deep within her shawl. Hudson saddled the mule, securing their provisions and a few trade goods they might need in town. Neither spoke much as they began their descent from the cabin, but the silence between them was comfortable, strengthened by shared purpose. The trail wound down through stands of pine and aspen, their path marked by patches of lingering snow and stretches of mud that made the going treacherous. The mule picked its way carefully, sometimes sliding on steep sections where the frost was still melting. Hudson led the animal while Scarlett walked beside him, gathering her skirts above the mud. By midday, they had descended enough to feel the full force of the spring thaw. Water trickled everywhere, dripping from branches, seeping from rocky outcrops, gathering in muddy pools that forced them to seek higher ground. The mule's hooves made sucking sounds in the wet earth, and more than once they had to stop to help the beast when it foundered in particularly deep mud. "Slower going than I reckoned," Hudson admitted as they paused to rest in a small clearing. Scarlett nodded, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley below. They had covered less ground than hoped, and the thought of spending another night in the open made her clutch her shawl tighter around the hidden documents. When evening approached, Hudson led them to a grove of cottonwoods near a river swollen with snowmelt. The trees offered some shelter from the wind, their bare branches creaking softly overhead. While Hudson tended to the mule and gathered firewood, Scarlett cleared a dry spot beneath the largest cottonwood and laid out their bedrolls. The fire cast dancing shadows as they ate their simple supper of cornbread and dried meat. Scarlett found herself thinking of other evenings by other fires, back when she cooked for the railroad camp. The memory of those days, of overheard conversations and desperate choices, made her shiver despite the warmth. Without thinking, she began to hum, soft and low at first. It was a hymn her mother used to sing while working, one about finding strength in troubled times. The melody trembled a bit, but grew stronger as she continued, filling the darkness beyond their fire with gentle notes. Hudson sat very still, his face half hidden in shadow, but she could feel him listening, and somehow that gave her courage to keep going. When she finished, the night seemed different somehow, less threatening, more filled with possibility. "That was right pretty," Hudson said quietly. "Your ma taught you that one?" Scarlett nodded, touched by his interest. She sang it most every evening while making supper, said it helped remind her that no trouble lasts forever. She poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise toward the stars. "I reckon we could use some of that reminder now." "Reckon so," Hudson agreed. They sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low, then settled into their bedrolls, the mule's occasional snorts and the river's rush filling the night air. Dawn came misty and cool, the river running high and fast with melted snow. They ate a cold breakfast, neither wanting to take time building another fire. The documents felt heavy against Scarlett's side as she watched Hudson study the churning water. "We'll need to cross here," he said finally. "Trail's too steep to follow the bank downstream." He looked at her carefully. "Water's high, but the mule can manage if we're smart about it." Scarlett nodded, trying to hide her apprehension. She had never learned to swim, and the thought of that cold water made her breath catch. But there was no other way forward, and they both knew it. Hudson led them downstream a ways, searching for the safest crossing point. He found a section where the river ran wider and somewhat shallower, though the current still looked fierce to Scarlett's eyes. They secured their provisions high on the mule's back, and Hudson double-checked every strap. "Stay close to the mule's upstream side," he instructed, his voice gentle but firm. "Hold the saddle if you need to. I'll lead us across." He squeezed her shoulder briefly, the touch conveying more reassurance than words could. The water was shockingly cold when they entered, making Scarlett gasp. It surged around their knees, trying to push them off balance. The mule snorted and balked at first, but Hudson's steady hand on the lead rope kept it moving. Scarlett gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles white with effort. Halfway across, the current grew stronger. Water splashed higher, soaking their clothes. Scarlett's skirts grew heavy, dragging at her legs. She thought of the documents pressed against her side, praying the oilcloth would keep them dry. The mule stumbled slightly on hidden rocks, making her heart leap into her throat. But Hudson's presence remained solid and sure ahead of her. His broad back acted as a brake against the current, making it easier for her to follow. Step by careful step, they made their way across until finally, blessedly, they felt the river bottom rising beneath their feet. They emerged on the far bank, water streaming from their clothes. Scarlett's legs trembled with cold and effort, but a fierce pride filled her chest. They had made it through together, just as they would face whatever waited in town. The rest of their journey passed more easily. The trail grew wider as they descended, showing signs of recent travel. By early afternoon, they began to see scattered homesteads in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the occasional bark of a dog carried across the valley. Scarlett felt her chest tighten as the first buildings of town came into view. The last time she had walked these streets, she had been an object of mockery and scorn. The memory of cruel laughter and jeering voices made her steps falter. Hudson must have sensed her distress. He dropped back to walk beside her, his hand finding hers. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle and steady. "You ain't alone this time," he said quietly. Scarlett squeezed his hand in response, drawing strength from his presence. The documents pressed against her side beneath the shawl, reminding her of their purpose. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about justice, about doing what was right for all those who had been wronged. They made their way through the outskirts of town, where muddy streets showed signs of spring activity. A few people glanced their way, but most were too busy with their own concerns to pay them much mind. Still, Scarlett kept close to Hudson's side as they approached the simple white church at the edge of the square. The building stood quiet in the afternoon light, its steeple reaching toward clouds that promised more spring rain. Scarlett touched the hidden documents one last time, drawing a deep breath. Whatever came next would change everything. For them, for the town, for all those affected by the railroad's deception. Hudson paused at the church steps, turning to face her. His eyes held a question, giving her one last chance to turn back. But Scarlett straightened her shoulders and nodded. They had come too far, through too much, to falter now. Together, they climbed the steps toward the church door, toward whatever justice or consequence awaited them inside. The church study felt close and warm after their long journey. Reverend Josiah Harlan sat behind his desk, the afternoon light catching dust motes as they drifted through the air. His silver-rimmed spectacles glinted in the glow of a brass lamp as he studied their faces. "Miss May, Mr. Boone," he said, gesturing to the wooden chairs before his desk. "What brings you to my door on this unsettled afternoon?" Scarlett's fingers trembled as she withdrew the oilcloth package from beneath her shawl. The documents inside had survived their river crossing, though the wrapping was damp at the edges. She placed them carefully on the desk, aware of how ordinary they looked for papers that held such dangerous truth. "These need to be seen by honest eyes, Reverend," Hudson said, his voice low and steady. "They show how the railroad men forged water rights, took land from both settlers and the Ute people through false papers." The Reverend's eyebrows rose as he carefully unwrapped the package. The lamplight grew stronger as shadows lengthened outside, making the paper's age-browned edges seem to glow. His fingers moved carefully through the stack, pausing now and then to adjust his spectacles or lean closer to examine a signature. Scarlett watched his face, her heart beating quick and uneven. She had carried these papers for so long, first in terror and then in hope. Now, seeing them spread across the Reverend's desk, they seemed both more and less than she remembered. Just ink and paper, but weighted with the power to bring justice or ruin. Reverend Harlan's frown deepened as he read, creating new creases in his weathered face. The tick of the wall clock seemed to grow louder in the silence, marking each moment of his scrutiny. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. "These are serious accusations," he said slowly. "If what these documents show is true, and I've no reason to doubt their authenticity, then many people have been grievously wronged." He removed his spectacles, polishing them with a cloth from his desk drawer. "I'll need time to study them properly, to understand the full scope of this deception." "How long?" Hudson asked, his tone careful. "Give me until Sunday's service," the Reverend replied, replacing his spectacles. "I'll have read them thoroughly by then and can better advise how to proceed." He looked directly at Scarlett. "You've shown great courage in bringing these forward, Miss May." Scarlett ducked her head, unused to such frank praise. "Thank you, Reverend," she whispered. Relief flickered through her as they left the study, though worry still gnawed at her edges. The documents were safe now, in honest hands, but their task wasn't finished. The spring evening had grown chill while they were inside, and shadows stretched long across the muddy street. "We should get to the livery," Hudson said quietly. "Find a place to bed down for the night." They turned down the alley that ran behind the general store, taking the shorter route to the stables. The narrow passage was dark with evening shadows, the buildings on either side blocking what remained of daylight. Their boots made soft sounds in the mud as they walked. The attack came without warning. Two men stepped out from behind stacked crates, their faces hidden by pulled-down hats. They moved fast, one driving straight for Hudson, while the other circled wide. Hudson met the first man with a powerful right hook, sending him staggering. But the second attacker struck from behind, landing a heavy blow to Hudson's ribs. The sound of it made Scarlett's stomach lurch. The alley erupted into chaos. Hudson fought like a cornered bear, his huge fists dealing punishment to both attackers. But they were skilled fighters too, and their numbers gave them advantage. One caught Hudson with a kick to his already injured side, making him grunt in pain. Scarlett stood frozen for a moment, terror holding her in place. Then she saw one of the thugs draw back for another strike at Hudson, who was struggling with the other man. Without thinking, she grabbed a lantern hanging from a stable wall. "Leave him be," she screamed, swinging the lantern with all her might at the second attacker's head. The man ducked, but her wild swing forced him to step back. The lantern's light swung crazily, casting wild shadows that made the alley seem to dance. It was enough of a distraction for Hudson to drive his elbow into the first man's face with a sickening crunch. The thug went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. His partner took one look at Hudson's advancing form and fled, disappearing into the gathering dark. For a moment, the only sounds were harsh breathing and the groans of the fallen man. "Run," Hudson gasped, clutching his side. "Boarding house, now." They fled through back streets and shadows, taking a twisting route to throw off any pursuit. By the time they reached the boarding house, both were winded and shaking. The proprietor took one look at their mud-splattered, disheveled state and handed over a key without question. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and washstand. A lamp burned low on the bedside table, casting warm light across worn floorboards. Hudson sank onto the bed with a barely suppressed groan, his face gray with pain. "Let me see," Scarlett said softly, moving to his side. Her hands shook as she helped him remove his coat and shirt, revealing angry bruising already spreading across his ribs. "Nothing broken," Hudson said through clenched teeth. "Just cracked some, had worse." Scarlett dipped a cloth in the washstand's basin, carefully cleaning dirt from his scratched knuckles. The water turned pink with blood, his and perhaps the other man's too. Her own hands were scraped from gripping the lantern's rough metal, but she hardly felt the sting. "I never thought I'd do something like that," she whispered, wringing out the cloth. "Swinging a lantern at a man like some wild thing. I've never." She trailed off, still amazed at her own actions. Hudson caught her hand, his huge fingers gentle despite their raw knuckles. "You're stronger than you know, Scarlett May," he said quietly. "Always have been. Just needed a chance to prove it to yourself." She looked at their joined hands, thinking of all that had happened since that morning at the hiring corner. She had run, hidden, crossed rivers, and now fought beside this man who had become so much more than just her employer. "I believe you," she said softly, and for the first time, she truly did. "I believe you." They sat in comfortable silence as night settled fully outside their window. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks gradually faded as the town settled for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had this moment of quiet victory. Hudson eventually dozed off, his breathing shallow but steady. Scarlett kept watch from a chair by the window, her hand still warm from where he had held it. The lantern burned low, but she left it lit, a small defiance against the darkness that had tried to silence them. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and bright, sunlight gilding the frost-touched grass around the white-painted church. The bell in the modest steeple tolled deep and clear, calling the faithful to worship. Wagons and buggies lined the muddy street as townsfolk in their Sunday best made their way inside, nodding greetings to neighbors and sharing quiet conversation. Scarlett's hands trembled as she smoothed her worn dress, the nicest she owned but still showing signs of hard use. She had spent an hour that morning trying to make herself presentable, knowing every eye would be upon her. Hudson walked beside her, his usual buckskins replaced by a clean shirt and vest that seemed to sit uncomfortably on his broad frame. His presence steadied her, though she could see the stiffness in his movements from his healing ribs. They climbed the church steps together, past whispering clusters of people who fell silent as they approached. Scarlett kept her eyes forward, fighting the urge to pull her shawl tighter around herself. The familiar shame tried to rise up, but she pushed it down. She had truth on her side now, even if her knees felt weak with fear. Inside, the church smelled of beeswax candles and fresh-cut pine boughs. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting rainbow patterns from the colored glass onto the wooden pews. Scarlett and Hudson took seats near the middle, not too close to the front, but not hiding in the back either. She could feel the weight of stairs on her back, hear the rustle of skirts as people shifted to look at them. The organ wheezed to life, playing the opening notes of Amazing Grace. The congregation rose, hymn books rattling, and began to sing. Scarlett's voice caught in her throat at first, but Hudson's deep rumble beside her gave her courage. By the second verse, she joined in, her clear alto rising with the others. Reverend Harlan stood at his pulpit as the last notes faded, his gray hair neatly combed, his black coat brushed free of dust. He began his sermon as he always did, speaking of God's love and mercy. But today something was different in his manner, a tension in his shoulders, a gravity in his eyes that made Scarlett's heart beat faster. Midway through his message, he paused. The silence stretched long enough that people began to shift in their seats, wondering if he had lost his place. Then he reached beneath his Bible and drew out a familiar packet of papers, holding them high so all could see. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "I must speak truth before God today. These documents came into my possession this week, and after careful study, I cannot in good conscience keep silent about their contents." A murmur ran through the congregation. Scarlett's fingers dug into the wooden pew until her knuckles turned white. Hudson's hand covered hers, warm and steadying. "These papers show a pattern of deception that has harmed both our settlers and our Ute neighbors," the Reverend continued. "Contract after contract bears forged signatures, stealing water rights from those who depend upon them for survival." He began to read, his voice steady and clear. Page after page detailed false claims, altered surveys, and signatures that belonged to people long dead or who had never existed. The gasps and mutters from the congregation grew louder with each revelation. "This creek, marked as unclaimed here, has been used by the White River Ute Band for generations," Reverend Harlan read. "Yet their rights were erased with a stroke of a pen, their protests ignored or suppressed." The church door banged open, cutting through the rising tension like a gunshot. Railroad agent Silas Granger stormed down the center aisle, his face mottled red with fury. Behind him came Marshal Avery, his badge gleaming in the colored light from the windows. "That's enough," Granger shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Scarlett. "She's a thief and a liar. Those documents were stolen from railroad offices. They're company property." "They're proof of your crimes," Hudson growled, starting to rise. But Scarlett gripped his arm, holding him back. She could see deputies filtering in through the door, hands on their gun belts. "Marshal," Granger demanded, "do your duty. Arrest that woman for theft." Marshal Avery stepped forward, his weathered face set in hard lines. "Miss May," he said, "you're under arrest for the theft of railroad property and interference with company business." The congregation sat frozen, watching as the marshal moved toward their pew. Some faces showed shock, others confusion, and a few, Scarlett noted with a stab of pain, held satisfaction at seeing her brought low again. "This is wrong," Hudson protested, his voice rough with anger. "She's exposed their lies. You can't arrest her for telling the truth." Two deputies grabbed his arms as he tried to stand. Hudson struggled, nearly breaking free despite his injured ribs, but more men piled on until they had him restrained. They dragged him toward the door, his boots leaving scuff marks on the clean floor. "Please," Scarlett said softly as the marshal reached for her. "Let me walk out on my own." Something flickered in Avery's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or shame, and he nodded. Scarlett stood, holding her head high despite the tears threatening to fall. She walked down the same aisle where she had entered with such hope, past the same faces that had once mocked her size and poverty. The morning sun seemed harsh now as they emerged from the church. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Scarlett saw the former foreman who had jeered at her that day at the hiring corner. His face showed a mean sort of pleasure at her predicament. Hudson was still struggling with the deputies near the steps. "Scarlett," he called, his voice raw. "I'll find a way. I won't let them." A deputy's fist drove into his stomach, silencing him. They dragged him away around the corner of the church, leaving Scarlett alone with the marshal and her shame. But this shame felt different from before. It wasn't the hot flush of humiliation she had known so often. Instead, it sat cold and hard in her chest, mixed with anger at the injustice being done. She had spent so long running from the truth, And now that she had finally stood to face it, she was being punished for her courage. Marshal Avery's hand was firm but not cruel on her arm as he led her down the street toward the jail. Church bells began to toll again, marking the end of the interrupted service. Scarlett walked steadily, though her heart felt as heavy as lead. The same streets where she had once ducked her head and hurried past, pointing fingers, now witnessed her arrest. But she refused to cower this time. Her hope might be crushed, but something stronger had taken root in its place. A determination that truth would prevail, no matter the cost. She thought of Hudson's words, "You're stronger than you know." She would need that strength now, more than ever. The jail's iron door creaked open before her, dark and uninviting. Scarlett took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing through the Sunday morning quiet like a final judgment. Through the barred window, she could still hear the last echoes of the church bells fading away, carrying with them the promise of justice yet unfulfilled. The iron door of the jail cell groaned shut with a heavy clang. Scarlett flinched at the sound, watching through the bars as Marshal Avery turned the key in the lock. The cell was small and cold, with only a narrow cot, a tin water cup, and a rough wool blanket for comfort. Late afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through a barred window high on the wall, casting shadows across the stone floor. Scarlett's wrists ached where the iron shackles bit into them. The marshal had insisted on the chains, though his eyes had held a shadow of regret as he'd locked them in place. Now she sat on the hard cot, the thin mattress doing little to cushion her from the metal frame beneath. The jail was quiet except for the occasional scrape of the deputy's boots as he made his rounds. Outside, she could hear the muffled sounds of the town going about its Sunday business. Wagon wheels on packed dirt, distant voices, the flutter of pigeons on the roof. The normalcy of it all made her situation feel even more surreal. To keep the tears at bay, Scarlett began to hum softly. The melody came naturally. "Sweet Hour of Prayer," one of her mother's favorites. Mama had sung it while kneading bread, while hanging laundry, while rocking sick children to sleep. The familiar tune brought comfort, even here in this cold cell. "Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That calls me from a world of care." The words caught in her throat, thick with emotion, but she forced herself to continue. Her mother's voice seemed to join with hers in memory, strong and clear as it had been all those years ago. Across town, in the shabby boarding house room he'd rented, Hudson Boone paced like a caged mountain lion. 5 steps to the window, 5 steps back to the door. His ribs screamed with each turn, but the pain only fed his fury. The deputies had worked him over good before letting him go, adding fresh bruises to his collection. He paused at the window, staring out at the street below. The jail was just visible at the end of the road, its stone walls solid and imposing in the fading light. His rifle leaned in the corner, cleaned and loaded. It would be simple enough to wait for nightfall, overpower the deputy on duty, and break Scarlett out. But then what? They'd be fugitives, hunted across the territory. That was no life for her. "Damn them all," he muttered, resuming his pacing. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots. His hands clenched and unclenched, itching to do something, anything, to make this right. But violence would only make things worse. He knew that in his bones, even as his anger screamed for action. The sun sank lower, painting the room in shades of amber and shadow. Hudson's steps slowed, then stopped. He stood in the center of the room, suddenly aware of how tired he was, how lost. When was the last time he'd felt this helpless? Not since the day he'd found his partner dead in the snow after the raid. Maybe. Without conscious thought, he found himself sinking to his knees beside the narrow cot. His hands clasped together, rough and calloused, unused to this gesture of supplication. He couldn't remember the last time he'd prayed properly, sent up plenty of quick requests in tight spots. Sure, but this was different. "Lord," he began, his voice hoarse. The words came slowly at first, stumbling and uncertain. "I'm angry. So damn angry I can hardly think straight. She didn't deserve this. She was trying to do right, to help people, and now she's in chains for it." He paused, struggling to order his thoughts. "I want to tear that jail apart with my bare hands. want to make them pay for hurting her. But I reckon that's not your way." His voice grew stronger as he continued, the prayer becoming more natural. "I don't know what to do. She needs help, real help, not just my fists and fury. Show me the path. Give me wisdom instead of anger. And, please," his voice cracked slightly, "please keep her safe in there. Give her strength. She's braver than she knows, but she shouldn't have to face this alone." In her cell, Scarlett had moved from hymns to prayer as well. She knelt on the cold stone floor, chains clinking softly as she clasped her hands. The position reminded her of countless Sunday mornings in church, but this prayer came from a deeper place than mere habit. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "I'm scared. I won't pretend I'm not. But I did what I thought was right, what you would want me to do. Those papers showed such wickedness, hurting so many people." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she continued, "I know Hudson wants to help me, but please keep him from doing anything rash. Don't let him throw his life away on my account." The chains rattled as she shifted position, her knees aching, against the stone. "I've spent so long being ashamed, of my size, of my past, of everything. But I'm not ashamed of telling the truth, even if it leads me here. Give me courage to face whatever comes. Help me stand strong, like Hudson believes I can." As the last light faded from her high window, Scarlett returned to her cot. The wool blanket was scratchy against her skin, but she pulled it close against the growing chill. In the darkness, she began to sing again, very softly. "Be not afraid. I go before you always." The hymn strengthened her, even as her voice trembled on the high notes. Hudson remained on his knees long after his prayer ended, watching the moon rise through his window. The fury that had driven him all day had quieted to a low simmer. In its place, he felt something else. Not peace exactly, but a kind of clarity. Violence wouldn't save Scarlett. There had to be another way, and he would find it. He finally rose, his knees creaking in protest. The cot squeaked as he lay down, still fully dressed except for his boots. Sleep seemed impossible, but he needed to rest, to think clearly tomorrow. As he stared at the ceiling, he found himself humming one of the hymns Scarlett had sung during their journey back to town. The melody brought her face to mind, not afraid or ashamed as she'd been in the church, but as she'd looked up on the mountain, strong and capable, finally seeing her own worth. Across the distance between them, both Scarlett and Hudson felt something shift in their hearts that night. Their separate prayers had risen together, weaving into something stronger than either could have managed alone. The road ahead was still dark and uncertain, but they were no longer relying solely on their own strength to face it. In her cell, Scarlett finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her mother's hymn still echoing in her mind. The chains were heavy on her wrists, but her spirit felt lighter than it had since her arrest. Whatever came next, she would face it with both courage and faith. Hudson, too, found rest at last, his anger banked to glowing coals rather than consuming flames. His last conscious thought was a renewed commitment. DIS. He would find a way to help Scarlett that didn't involve more violence. Justice, real justice, had to be possible, even here on the frontier. Tomorrow would show the way. The night deepened over the sleeping town. In the jail and the boarding house, two souls who had found each other against all odds now found their way to peace, though separated by stone walls and iron bars. Their prayers lingered in the darkness like stars, points of light in the midst of shadow, promising that dawn would come again. Gray morning light crept through the narrow window of Scarlett's cell, painting thin stripes across the stone floor. She shifted on the hard cot, her muscles stiff from the cold night. The chains clinked softly as she sat up, trying to smooth her wrinkled dress with bound hands. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor. The jailer, a sour-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth, appeared at her cell door. He carried a tin plate with a chunk of hard bread and a battered cup of water. Rather than hand them through the bars properly, he bent down and shoved them roughly across the floor, sloshing water onto the stones. "Breakfast for the railroad thief," he sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "Though if you ask me, they're feeding you too well already." His eyes raked over her figure with familiar mockery before he turned away. keys jangling at his belt as he retreated down the hall. Scarlett waited until his footsteps faded before reaching for the meager meal. The bread was stale and the water had a metallic taste, but she forced herself to eat. She would need her strength, though for what, she wasn't sure. Across town, Hudson Boone was already moving with purpose through the awakening streets. His ribs still ached, but determination drove him forward. Violence wouldn't free Scarlett, or prove her innocence. He needed allies, people who would stand up and speak truth alongside them. His first stop was the Triple R Ranch, where old Jake Reynolds worked his cattle. The rancher was already out by his corral, checking his horses as the sun climbed higher. He straightened up as Hudson approached, squinting against the morning light. "Boone." Jake nodded cautiously. "What brings you out this early?" Hudson leaned against the fence post, choosing his words carefully. "Reckon you remember when your South Creek dried up 2 summers ago? Right after the railroad pushed through?" Jake's weathered face darkened. "Remember it clear as yesterday. Lost near 20 head of cattle before we could dig a new well. Railroad claimed they had water rights, showed papers and everything. But," he trailed off, spitting into the dust. "Those papers were forged," Hudson said quietly. "The woman they've got in jail? She's got proof. Proof that would help a lot of folks who lost water rights they should have kept." Jake was silent for a long moment, running calloused fingers along the fence rail. "That why they locked her up? To keep her quiet?" Hudson nodded. "She tried to do right by bringing it to light. Now she's paying the price for speaking truth. Whole thing stank from the start," Jake admitted. "But what can plain folks do against the railroad?" "Come to church on Sunday," Hudson suggested. "Stand with us. Show them we won't be silenced one by one." Jake studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Might just do that." About time somebody spoke up. Hudson's next stop was a small house on the edge of town, where widow Sarah Chen tended her vegetable garden. Her well had gone dry the same summer as Jake's Creek, forcing her to carry water from town every day just to keep her plants alive. She listened intently as Hudson explained about Scarlett and the documents, her dark eyes sharp despite her aged face. When he finished, she set down her trowel and brushed dirt from her apron. "I lost more than water when those men came with their papers," she said softly. "I lost the dream my Henry and I built together. This garden was our pride." She touched a tomato vine gently. "Tell me what you need, Mr. Boone." "Your voice," Hudson replied. "Your presence at church this Sunday. Show them that one person's truth speaks for many." "I'll be there," she promised. "And I'll speak to others who lost their water too. There are more of us than they think." Throughout the day, Hudson moved carefully through town, speaking quietly to those he knew had suffered from the railroad schemes. A shopkeeper whose brother lost his farm, a blacksmith whose forge pond was drained. Each conversation had to be handled delicately. People were still afraid of the railroad's power, but their anger at past injuries ran deep. The sun was setting when Hudson returned to his boarding house. The keeper, Mrs. O'Malley, caught him in the hallway. She glanced both ways before leaning close. "Word spreading," she whispered, her Irish lilt barely audible. "I've heard talk all day. People are remembering their own troubles with those railroad men. Many say they'll come Sunday, though some are still fearful." Hudson touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged for telling me, ma'am." She patted his arm. "That poor girl in the jail. She did a brave thing, standing up to them, braver than most of us have been." In her cell, Scarlett sat on her cot as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. The day had been long and lonely, filled with nothing but the echo of boots in the corridor and the distant sounds of town life beyond the thick walls. But something felt different now. Through her high window, she could hear fragments of conversation from passers-by on the street. More voices than usual seemed to pause near the jail, speaking in low, urgent tones. Though she couldn't make out the words, there was a new energy in those whispers, like electricity, and in the air before a storm. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine Hudson out there somewhere, working to help her. The thought warmed her heart, even as the cell grew colder with approaching night. Whatever he was doing, she knew he wouldn't abandon her. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered into the gathering darkness, "for sending me a friend when I most needed one, for giving me strength to speak truth, even though I'm afraid. Please let good come from all of this." Back in his room, Hudson sat on the edge of his bed, hope kindling in his chest for the first time since Scarlett's arrest. The people he'd spoken to today had been cautious but receptive. Each one knew others who had suffered similar losses. If enough of them found the courage to stand together, perhaps the railroad's grip on the town could finally be broken. He thought of Scarlett in her cell, remembering how she'd faced down public mockery with quiet dignity. She deserved to know she wasn't alone anymore, that others were beginning to see the truth she'd risked everything to reveal. Leaning back against the wall, Hudson let out a long breath. Tomorrow he would continue his quiet campaign, building support one conversation at a time. Sunday would show whether enough people were ready to take a stand for justice. For now, he could only pray that the whispers spreading through town would grow into voices strong enough to be heard. Outside, the spring wind carried those whispers from porch to porch, shop to shop, house to house. Something was stirring in the town's conscience, a long-buried sense of right and wrong rising to the surface. In her cell, Scarlett sensed it. In his room, Hudson nurtured it. And in homes throughout the town, people began to remember their own stories of loss and injustice, preparing to speak them aloud at last. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool, the spring sun casting long shadows across the dusty streets of town. Already at 6 o'clock, people were moving with unusual purpose toward the white-steepled church. They gathered in small clusters on the boardwalk and near the hitching posts, heads bent close in whispered conversation. Hudson Boone stood in his boarding room, carefully checking the contents of the leather satchel one final time. The documents inside represented more than just paper and ink. They held Scarlett's freedom and the town's redemption. His ribs still ached from the alley fight, but determination drove the pain from his mind. He pulled on his best shirt, the one Scarlett had mended for him during their weeks in the mountain cabin. Outside his window, the church bell began to toll, its deep bronze voice calling the faithful to worship. Hudson watched as more townspeople emerged from their homes, dressed in their Sunday finest. There were faces he recognized from his quiet conversations throughout the week. U.S. Self, Jake Reynolds leading his family down the street, Widow Chen walking slowly but purposefully with her cane, the blacksmith and his apprentices. He lifted the satchel and made his way downstairs. Mrs. O'Malley stood at the bottom, wringing her apron in nervous hands. "God be with you today, Mr. Boone," she whispered. "We'll all be there." Hudson touched the brim of his hat in thanks and stepped out into the morning light. The crowd around the church had grown larger than any regular Sunday service he could remember. People pressed close as he approached, their eyes following the satchel in his hand. A path cleared for him up the wooden steps. Inside, the church was already half full, though it was still 20 minutes before the regular service time. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the colored beams. Hudson made his way to the front pew, setting the satchel carefully beside him. More people filed in behind him, their boots and shoes creating a steady rhythm on the plank floor. Reverend Harlan emerged from his study, his normally composed face showing signs of strain. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his Bible on the pulpit. When his eyes met Hudson's, there was both fear and resolution in his gaze. The pews filled quickly. Soon people were standing along the walls and at the back of the church. Hudson noticed the marshal slip in just before the hour, taking up position near the door. The railroad agent, Silas Granger, sat in his usual place near the front, but his usual swagger seemed diminished by the unusual crowd. As the final bell tolled, Reverend Harlan raised his hands for silence. The murmuring congregation grew still. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice catching slightly, "we gather today not just for regular worship, but to face a grave matter that affects us all." He paused, gathering strength. "Mr. Boone has something to share with us. I've seen the evidence he carries, and I believe we must hear it. Mr. Boone." Hudson stood slowly, lifting the satchel. He felt every eye in the church upon him as he walked to the pulpit. Setting the documents carefully on the wooden surface, he turned to face the congregation. "Most of you know me as a man of few words," he began, his deep voice carrying to the furthest corner. "Today I speak for someone who can't be here, Miss Scarlet May, who sits in jail for trying to tell the truth." He opened the satchel, removing the first document. 3 years ago, Scarlet worked as a cook in the railroad camp. She saw men forging signatures on water rights contracts. Right, stealing water from honest folks like Jake Reynolds and Widow Chen. He held up the paper. She took these documents, not for profit, but because she knew it was wrong. Silas Granger surged to his feet. "That's railroad property. She's nothing but a common thief." Several voices shouted him down. Jake Reynolds stood up from his pew. "Let him speak," Hudson continued, his steady gaze sweeping the room. "Scarlet carried these papers for years, afraid but unwilling to destroy the only proof of what was done to this town. When she trusted me with her secret, I saw a woman braver than any man who's tried to silence her." He handed the documents to Reverend Harlan. "These contracts show how water rights were stolen from both settlers and Ute families. Every signature forged, every witness paid off, every date falsified." The Reverend's hands were steady now as he took the first contract. His clear voice rang out as he read the details: dates, names, locations. With each document, the evidence mounted. Altered numbers, impossible dates, signatures that couldn't be real because the supposed signers had been dead for months. A low rumble of anger began to build in the church. Hudson saw faces darkening with recognition as people heard familiar names and places. The marshal shifted uncomfortably by the door. Silas Granger tried again to interrupt, pushing his way toward the front. This time, 3 ranchers stepped into his path. "Sit down," one growled. "We're hearing this out." The reading continued. Reverend Harlan's voice grew stronger with each page, as if the truth itself was giving him courage. When he finished the last document, the silence in the church was absolute. Then a voice called out from the back, "My brother lost his farm because of those water rights." "They drained my forge pond," the blacksmith added. More voices joined in, years of quiet grievances finally finding voice. The murmur swelled to an angry chorus. The marshal stepped forward, raising his hands. "Now see here," he began. "We can't just take the word of some fat cook who stole private property. Shame on you." Widow Chen's voice cut through the clamor. She stood, leaning on her cane. "That fat cook had more courage than you, taking bribes to look the other way while honest people suffered." The marshal's face reddened, but his protests were drowned out by the crowd. People were standing now, calling out their own stories of loss and betrayal. Hudson watched as the truth he and Scarlet had carried for so long took root in the community's heart. Reverend Harlan raised his Bible. "The Lord says, 'The truth shall set you free.' Today we've heard truth that's been hidden too long. I say we march to the jail and demand Miss May's release. Amen." The response was thunderous. People began moving toward the doors, their purpose clear. Hudson gathered the documents carefully back into the satchel. He caught Silas Granger slipping out a side door, no doubt heading for his office to destroy more evidence. But it was too late. The truth was out now, carried in too many voices to be silenced. Outside, the crowd was growing. More townspeople joined as word spread. Hudson saw women who had once mocked Scarlet, now calling for her freedom. Men who had laughed at her size stood shoulder to shoulder with those demanding justice. The marshal tried one last time to assert authority, drawing his pistol. "This is unlawful assembly." Jake Reynolds stepped forward, 6 feet of weathered rancher facing down the badge. "No, sir. This here's the law finally being done right. Now either help us or step aside." The marshal's hand trembled. Slowly, he holstered his gun and stepped back. The crowd surged forward, their voices rising in righteous anger, moving as one toward the jail where Scarlet waited. Hudson walked with them, the satchel secure in his hands, his heart full of hope. The truth had taken root at last, and like a seed breaking through hard ground, it would not be stopped from growing into something beautiful and just. The The morning sun climbed higher as the crowd moved through the streets, their shadows stretching behind them like banners of approaching change. In her cell, Scarlett would soon hear their footsteps, their voices, their determination to right a long-standing wrong. Hudson quickened his pace, knowing that the moment of her vindication was finally at hand. Dusk painted the western sky in deep purples and golds as lantern lights began appearing in the streets of town. One by one, then in clusters, townsfolk gathered around the jailhouse, their flames creating a warm glow in the growing darkness. The wooden walls of the jail seemed to shrink under the presence of so many determined faces. Inside her cell, Scarlett heard the shuffle of boots and murmur of voices growing louder. Her heart beat faster, uncertain whether to fear or hope. The iron bars cast long shadows across the floor as lamplight filtered through the window. Marshal Avery paced near his desk, his face drawn with tension. Outside, the crowd had swelled to nearly 100 people. Their voices grew more insistent, calling for justice and Scarlett's release. The marshal's hand trembled as he fingered his badge. Hudson Boone's deep voice carried above the others. "Marshal, you know what's right. Open that cell." The crowd pressed closer, their lanterns held high. Through the barred window, Scarlett could see familiar faces: the widow Chen, Jake Reynolds, the blacksmith and his wife. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had once turned up her nose at Scarlett in the mercantile, stood among them holding a lamp. Finally, Marshal Avery's shoulders sagged. He reached for his ring of keys with a shaking hand. The iron lock clicked, and the cell door creaked open. Scarlett stepped out slowly, her head bowed from habit. She had walked through town as an object of scorn so many times before, but now, different sounds reached her ears. "Miss May," called Widow Chen warmly. "God bless you, Scarlett," said the Reverend's wife. "You showed real courage, miss," added Jake Reynolds. She raised her eyes to find not mockery, but respect in the faces before her. Hudson stepped forward, his scarred face gentle in the lamplight. He held out his hand, and she took it gratefully, drawing strength from his firm grip. Together they walked out of the jailhouse. The crowd parted to let them through, then fell in behind them like a protective wall. Lanterns bobbed and swayed as they moved through the darkening streets toward the church. The white-painted church glowed softly against the purple evening sky. Its doors stood open, welcoming them all inside. Scarlett paused at the threshold, overwhelmed by the moment. Hudson's hand squeezed hers gently, encouraging her forward. Reverend Harlan stood at the pulpit, his Bible open before him. As the congregation filled the pews, their lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls. Scarlett and Hudson sat in the front row, where she had sat that morning when truth first broke free. The Reverend raised his hands, and the rustling crowd grew still. "Let us pray," he said, his voice carrying to every corner. "Lord, we come before you tonight asking for mercy and justice. We have seen how truth can heal old wounds and open hardened hearts. We thank you for giving courage to those who stood for right, and wisdom to those who learned to see with new eyes." Scarlett felt tears welling up as the Reverend continued. Years of shame and fear began cracking like river ice in spring. Each word of the prayer seemed to wash away another layer of pain, until her tears flowed freely. She felt Hudson's strong shoulder beside her, steady as a mountain. When the prayer ended, people came forward to shake her hand, to offer quiet words of support or ask forgiveness for past unkindness. The marshal stood at the back, his badge no longer pinned to his chest. Even Silas Granger was absent, having fled toward the railroad office as darkness fell. Later that night, Scarlett and Hudson sat together on the boarding house porch. The street was quiet now, the lanterns extinguished. Stars twinkled overhead in the vast Colorado sky. The usual evening noise from the saloon was muted, as if the whole town was holding its breath, reflecting on the day's events. Scarlett ran her fingers over her worn shawl, remembering how she had once used it to hide from staring eyes. Now the cool evening air felt clean and fresh on her face. "I never thought I would see this day," she said softly. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Hudson." Hudson turned to her, his scarred face peaceful in the starlight. "God never gave up on you, Scarlett," he replied, his voice gentle but firm, "and neither did I." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. The night air carried the scent of pine from the mountains, and the promise of morning yet to come. Dawn brought a stir of excitement to the town as hoofbeats echoed down the main street. 6 Ute riders approached at a measured pace, their horses' flanks gleaming in the morning Sunday. Chief Running Fox led them, his face stern but dignified as townsfolk gathered on the boardwalks. Reverend Harlan stepped forward, his Bible tucked under one arm. He raised his hand in peaceful greeting as the riders halted before the church steps. The chief dismounted gracefully, his dark eyes taking in the scene with careful consideration. "We heard stories," Running Fox said, his English clear and measured. "Stories of papers showing stolen water rights." The Reverend nodded solemnly. "Yes, we have discovered great wrongs were done, to both settler and Ute alike." Scarlett stood near the church door, her heart pounding. Hudson's steady presence at her shoulder gave her courage. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, the precious documents clutched in her trembling hands. I kept these safe," she said softly, extending the papers. "When I worked at the railroad camp, I saw them changing the marks on the contracts, taking water that wasn't theirs to take." Running Fox studied her for a long moment, noting her nervous stance but unwavering gaze. He accepted the documents with careful hands, examining each page while his men waited silently. From the corner of her eye, Scarlett saw Silas Granger slinking toward the stage depot, carpetbag in hand. No one moved to stop him. His shame was punishment enough. The Ute leader looked up from the papers, his expression softening slightly as he regarded Scarlett. He nodded once, a gesture full of dignity and respect. "You showed great courage," he said. "Your truth helps both your people and mine." Hudson's hand found Scarlett's shoulder, squeezing gently with pride. She stood straighter, amazed that her simple act of preservation had bridged a gap between two peoples long divided by mistrust. That evening, golden lamplight spilled from the church windows onto the dusty street. Inside, the pews filled with townsfolk dressed in their Sunday best, their faces expectant. The soft glow of oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls as Reverend Harlan stood at the pulpit, his Bible open before him. Scarlett sat in the front pew, her heart full. No longer did she hide in the shadows at the back of the church. Her worn shawl was draped neatly around her shoulders, and her cheeks were flushed with peace rather than shame. "We gather to give thanks," Reverend Harlan's voice rang clear, "for courage shown and mercy given. The Lord works through the least expected vessels, teaching us to see with his eyes, not our own." After the final, "Amen," Hudson shifted beside Scarlett. His large hands trembled slightly as he rose to his feet, an unfamiliar nervousness in his bearing. The congregation fell silent, watching the mountain man who rarely spoke more than 2 words together. "Folks," Hudson's deep voice filled the church, "when I chose Scarlett that day, it weren't for cooking or mending." He paused, gathering his words carefully. "I saw strength where others saw weakness, a brave heart where others showed cruelty." Scarlett's eyes widened as Hudson turned to face her fully. "Scarlett May," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "would you stand with me, not as my helper, but as my wife and partner before God and these witnesses?" Gasps echoed through the church, followed by murmurs of delight. Scarlett rose on trembling legs, tears streaming down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Hudson's strong fingers wrapped around hers as the congregation burst into applause. Reverend Harlan raised his hands, and the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the church, lifting toward heaven with joy. Thick snowflakes drifted lazily from the steel-gray sky as Hudson guided the mule cart along the mountain trail. Beside him, Scarlett watched the familiar landmarks pass, each bend and creek now holding memories of their first journey together. The cart creaked under the weight of new supplies, sacks of flour and sugar, jars of preserves, and carefully wrapped gifts from townspeople who had once scorned her. "Almost home," Hudson said softly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Home." The word settled in Scarlett's heart like a warm ember. When they crested the final ridge, The cabin came into view, its sturdy logs and stone chimney a welcome sight against the snowy pines. Smoke still curled from the chimney. Widow Bennett had tended the hearth while they were in town, keeping the cabin warm for their return. Hudson helped Scarlett down from the cart, his strong hands gentle at her waist. Together they carried their supplies inside, making several trips as the snow continued to fall. The familiar scent of pine and wood smoke greeted them, along with the lingering warmth of the banked fire. Scarlett moved to the hearth, adding kindling and logs until flames danced merrily. Hudson struck a match to light the oil lamp, and golden light spilled across the cabin's interior. Everything looked different now, not just a shelter, but truly their home. With reverent care, Scarlett unpacked the gifts from grateful townspeople. A hand-stitched quilt from the seamstress, pottery bowls from the general store, preserved fruits from the widow's orchard. Each item represented not just generosity, but respect, something she had never known in town before. She unwrapped her shawl, the same worn garment she had once clutched around herself like armor. Now she hung it beside the fire to warm, no longer needing its protection to hide herself from cruel eyes. Hudson finished storing the supplies, then came to stand behind her. His arms settled across her shoulders, strong and sure. In the lamplight, his scars seemed softer, like badges of survival rather than marks of pain. He said quietly, "Maybe raise some chickens. The south slope would be good for vegetables." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Plenty of room for little ones, too, if the good Lord sees fit to bless us." Scarlett leaned into his embrace, tears gathering in her eyes. Not tears of shame or fear this time, but of joy. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "A real home. A husband who—" Her voice caught. "Who loves you," Hudson finished simply. "Who saw the truth of you that first day." Outside, a wolf's howl echoed across the mountain, answered by its pack. But inside the cabin, all was peace and warmth. Scarlett stood in the circle of Hudson's arms, no longer the scorned woman at the hiring corner, no longer the fat one, mocked by cruel tongues. Here she was simply herself, a wife beloved, a woman of courage, the keeper of a home built on truth and dignity. The lamp's glow filled every corner of the cabin as night settled over the mountain, and Scarlett knew with bone-deep certainty that she had finally, truly come home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.